Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust.
This show has been brought to you by the letter E.
Hey everyone, it's good to be back. If I'm looking or sounding a little raggedy around the edges, I have been down with the flu for 2 weeks. So this is me recovering. Apologies for any discomfort on your ears or eyes. All right, so today we are doing E, and E is for one of my favorite subjects to talk about, ethnoarchaeology. So, what is ethnoarchaeology? The book definition, and this is literally from the book, that's Renfrew and Bonn, one of the most popular archaeology textbooks. Anyway, the book definition of ethnoarchaeology is the study of contemporary societies with a view towards understanding the behavioral relationships which underlie the past material record. All right, let me translate what that means. So, as we already know from A is for archaeology, archaeology is the study of the human past through the material record. So, what that means on a day to day basis is archaeology is kind of like being a historical detective.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
You go to some place, you find all this stuff, and you say, what was going on here? Who did this? What were they doing? What does it all mean? And the trouble with that is from the material record, which are our clues, oftentimes it's totally puzzling, the answer to all those questions, or maybe there's multiple possible explanations, and there just isn't enough evidence to really come down with a firm interpretation. So there's a few different ways to test our hypotheses or actually generate new ones. One of my favorites is another E term, which is experimental archaeology. Now, I love that, so we're definitely going to be doing that with our next E as we run through the alphabet again. But for now, let's stick to ethnoarchaeology. So what ethnoarchaeology involves is going to some far-flung corner of the world to directly observe a present-day culture, or more likely going to the library and reading anthropological reports about some, extant community at some time recently. And it's trying to see how what they did created a material record, and then comparing that to our little archaeological mystery to see if we can find a match or a good comparison. Now, I know that's very abstract, so let me make it clearer through some concrete examples. First off, Louis Binford, who I discussed in a previous episode, he did some experimental archaeology with the Nanamuit tribe in Alaska. Now, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was studying some Paleolithic sites in France and trying to make sense of what he was finding in the material record. So he went to the Nanamuit, who were essentially a hunter-gatherer people at this time, between 1969 and 1973. That's right after ethnoarchaeology became really popular in the 50s and 60s. And what he did was he traveled with them as they hunted to these sort of like campsites where they would take their kills. I'm guessing seals, but it could be also bear or moose or some other things that live up in the Arctic or in Alaska. And they would process the carcasses of those things in these spots. So they'd sharpen tools, and they'd strip the meat off the bone, and they'd carve the bone, and they'd deposit stuff. So Binford, in observing their activity, identified toss zones, drop zones, different spatial organization of the camps, and was able to sort of record what these guys were doing. So using the insights of where different sizes and types of debris were deposited, Binford interpreted the site of Pincevent, a 15,000-year-old Paleolithic site in France. And this site was actually originally excavated by André Leroy-Gorin, who we discussed in the C for Chien opératoire episode, because he was the guy who came up with Chien opératoire. Now, anyway, what Binford did was comparing the debris patterns with what he saw in Alaska. He interpreted the site as being, I think, involving some tent-like structures, and there were several hearths. He identified a site, I believe, where the hunter sat and sort of processed the kills. So he was able to, using the ethnoarchaeological comparison with a present day contemporary culture, he was able to figure out, or at least claim he figured out, what was going on in this old site in Pensevant. Now, there's lots of other fun examples. From my studies, I look at early medieval Britain in particular. And at that time, the buildings didn't really survive because they were all made of wood. So when you look for buildings from that period nowadays, all you see are kind of stains in the grounds. So you learn a lot more from burials. That's our main window into this past society, because there's not buildings left, or very few, and there's very, very little writing left from that time. Now, in the 1970s, Ian Hodder, who I've also discussed previously, wanted to take on this relatively simplistic notion that the stuff, the burial goods that someone is buried with, is a reflection of their social rank, how wealthy and powerful they are. And at a certain level, that makes a lot of sense. Oftentimes, the burials that we find that are very lavish with carvings and riches are the burials of pharaohs and kings. However, the idea that there's a direct relationship between how elaborate a burial is and how highly ranked that person was in society, that's not necessarily a direct relationship. So what Ian Hodder did to sort of criticize this simplistic view was he looked at funerary practices among the Nuba in Sudan and the Romas, also commonly known as gypsies in Britain. And what he showed is that the funerary practices of those peoples really reflected more about the society's view towards death and other spiritual matters, as opposed to the status of the deceased.
In ancient times, man was ignorant as to the cause and nature of death, so death was greeted with a certain degree of awe. But because man did not have the time for complicated rituals, funeral services were often brief.
Now, thinking about also contemporary societies nowadays, in a lot of different contexts like Judaism, like Islam, funerals are relatively austere practices. In Judaism, what you do for a dead person, your grave good, is you put a stone on their tomb. So even from contemporary religions, if you think someone's going to dig us up in the future, this idea, which seems obvious, that lavish burials mean rich and powerful person, not necessarily true. If you think about Tibetan sky burials, basically what they do is hack someone up and leave them for the birds. So how much are you really going to be able to tell by what's left of the people? Not that much. So Ian Hodder deconstructed this using ethnoarchaeological observations. Another somewhat morbid example surrounds cave paintings, which we've discussed previously in the Cosque Mediterranee and some of the archaeology news segments. Now, if you remember, cave paintings, a lot of these are like 30 or 40,000 years old, and they depict like stenciled hands. Somebody traced their hands, and that's the painting on the wall of the cave. And a lot of these seem to be missing digits. Now, there was a team out of Australia who essentially interpreted this as a kind of a sign language. So this also, using ethnoarchaeological observations of current or recent hunter societies, when people are hunting, they have to be very quiet. And so a lot of them develop a kind of sign language. And there's even some thought that that was sort of the earliest form of language before articulated words. But in any event, they are positing, using different ethnoarchaeological examples, that the different hands and with missing digits on these cave paintings are actually just depictions of their sign language. And they even considered that some of what they found was a sort of hunting calendar, which talked about the behaviors of different kinds of animals at different parts of the year. So they even claim to have interpreted some of this, and that would make it by far the earliest example of writing in human history. However, the interpretation from another study claims, and this is pretty gruesome, that those missing digits actually are missing, and that some of these folks ritualistically removed their finger digits. Now, again, that sounds crazy, but they found something like 100 ethnoarchaeological examples, comparisons of societies in which people do this, remove digits for non-medical reasons. For example, the death of a child. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds really like a stupid thing to do for people who have to hunt. But there's explanations for that. Perhaps the people who were doing the hand painting were not the people doing the hunting. Or even imagine something, and I don't know if they have an ethnoarchaeological example for this, but it's possible. Imagine people who, like, they're so good at hunting, they're like, look at how good I am. I'm going to chop off a finger and I can still hunt.
Whatever, I do what I want.
And that shows how special they were. So it was like a status thing. Or imagine if some societies had enough of a surplus, they had become good enough at hunting. Well, the powerful people or the relatively rich people, maybe they don't even need to hunt. So if you're removing a finger, you're like, hey, I don't even need to do work. So there are examples, and there's so many societies and cultures on this planet that they find some pretty far out things. Now, this actually kind of highlights one of the weaknesses of ethnoarchaeology. And these two examples, one that people removed their digits, the other that it's a sign language, is, it provides analogies, but you can often find multiple analogies that work. And it's, they're often not a perfect match, and it's often difficult to determine which one is actually the right answer. Also, as this technique is typically used to interpret really the oldest and most obscure sites where there's no written evidence or even complex artistical representations to interpret what's going on, the ethnoarchaeologists need to look for usually very rustic hunter-gatherer societies. And as we know, these are becoming more and more rare in today's modern world. Now, there are some of them, like deep in the Amazon or in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in India, but for ethical reasons, you cannot contact those. They're called non-contacted or uncontacted societies. You're not allowed to bother those people. So often what happens is archaeologists look for old ethnographic and ethnological reports. Now, a lot of those are done with varying degrees of rigor, so they're not as rigorous if it's old as they would be today. And of course, a lot of those people who were being studied, either their livelihoods and lifestyles have changed, or they no longer really exist as a people. In any event, they're not really there to ask them why they did things, to directly observe. So they're typically looking at older studies, which might make the comparison a little bit difficult. However, with AI and digitalization, it should become easier to do this kind of research, to pull the right kinds of comparisons in the future. And, this is really fascinating research that produces often surprising and controversial results. So that is ethnoarchaeology, E for ethnoarchaeology.
Archaeology porn.
Hey everyone, so welcome to the next edition of Archaeology Porn. And today's going to be an interesting one because we're looking at the really old stuff. Now, what do I mean? We're talking about Palaeoarchaeology. Now, this gets a little bit confusing. So what is Palaeoarchaeology? Palaeoarchaeology is the study of the human past through the physical remains, material remains, as you know, of ancient hominins up until about 10,000 years ago. Now, why that's confusing is there's a whole bunch of other disciplines. There's paleontology, which is that same time period, but that's the study of ancient life. And I guess life includes humans, or hominins, but it's other types of life forms also. And then there's paleoanthropology, which is the study of, human culture and society, but in these same ancient times. Now, because people at this time and hominins, which is not only Homo sapiens, we'll get into that in a moment, didn't have any writing or obviously elaborate culture, the only thing you do find are the remains, the bodies occasionally, and some really rudimentary stone tools and maybe carved things. So in this context, I don't really get what the difference is between paleoarchaeology, paleoanthropology. It sounds all like the same thing to me, but somebody fact check me on that. Anyway, let's first start by defining what is a hominin, because I used that word. And to do this, we're going to have to go back way back to high school biology. And this is to the system called binomial nomenclature, which is the system of giving scientific names and classifications to living organisms. So the way that you do that is there's successively smaller categories. It's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, there is a fun way to remember that. I think it's like King, Philip, can't order, fries, something. I don't remember. But anyway, I just gave it to you there. Now, so what is hominin? So we humans, like our monkey friends, are all in the same order, which is primates. So we're all primates. Now, below that order, there are several families. Okay, so there's gorillas, there's pans, as in chimpanzee, and then there's one called hominidae, which sounds like a neighborhood in Seoul. But anyway, that's the one that we're in, hominidae, which is our family. Now, there are some subgroupings like subfamilies, and below that, there's another subgrouping called tribe. Okay, so hominin is the tribe that Homo sapiens, us human beings, are in. And by the way, binomial nomenclature is the genus and the species. That's the scientific name for any species. That's why we're Homo sapien. Our genus is Homo, species is sapien, tribe is hominin, etc., etc. So this tribe, hominin, is what paleoarchaeologists study. So it's not only Homo sapiens, because it goes way back. If you remember from some edition of Archaeology News, I talked about those carpenters, which were something like 200,000 years old. That's another kind of hominin that a paleoarchaeologist would study. So yes, that does mean there are plenty of other hominins around, other homos around, and you probably heard of some of them. Neanderthals, I forget what the scientific name of them is. There's Homo habilis, Homo erectus. So those are some of the other members of our little tribe here. But we Homo sapiens have the distinction of probably being the only kind of hominin that was around when there were none others around. There's none other around today, so we are the ultimate survivors.
The winner of the first survivor competition is Rich. Congratulations, Rich.
Anyway, so the subject of today's archaeology porn, Lucy, she is from another species called Afarensis, and that's part of the genus, which is Australopithecus. Now, fun pseudo fact, because a lot of this stuff is still contentious and in flux, we're not directly descended from Lucy. We're descended from another species within the Australopithecus genus. So Lucy isn't sort of like our mother. She's kind of like a second cousin or aunt by marriage. So we're not directly descended from her species. Now, the name Afarensis for that species, that's named, shares a name with Afar, which is a region in Ethiopia and Djibouti. And there's a people there called the Afar people. And let me tell you, this region is wild. It's full of some of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, something like from another planet. For example, the Danakil Depression is basically a bubbling, festering version of Mordor on Earth.
In the land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring to control all others.
And in nearby Djibouti, where I've been also, you can find poisonous, acidic, and saline lakes, a dead forest, and blackened earth, which is rent by volcanoes. So it's quite the holiday spot. Anyway, Lucy was found in 1974 in this region, but in a somewhat more hospitable part. But in any event, when she lived, it was more forested, a little bit more friendly for human habitation, although there weren't humans when she was found, not Homo sapiens, because she was found, she lived. She was found in 74. She lived 3.18 million years ago. So that is a very, very, very long time. Now, this puts Lucy at the very beginning of her species, Australopithecus Afarensis. Let's just call them AA. So this puts Lucy at the very beginning of AA's time on Earth, because they appeared about 3 million years ago. She's 3.18 million years old, so very beginning of their time. And they survived for 700,000 to 900,000 years on Earth, which actually makes them one of the longest surviving hominids in world history. And to give you an idea, that's more than twice as long as our species, Homo sapiens. So these guys were survivors too.
I'm a survivor. I'm not gonna give up. I'm not gonna stop. I'm gonna work harder.
What more can we say about these AAs? Well, first of all, they were very sexually dimorphous, much more so than humans. What does sexually dimorphous mean? It means there's a big difference between males and females. For example, males were typically about 1.7 meters tall, 5'7", just a bit shorter than I am, and they usually weighed about 64 kilos or about 151 pounds. Females, on the other hand, were usually just a meter tall, which is 3'3", and 25 kilos or 55 pounds, so much, much smaller than the men. Now, Lucy herself was a little tall. She was 1.1 meters or 3'7", and she weighed about 29 kilos, or I think that's about 64 pounds, something along those lines. So she was a little bit on the bigger side for females. Now, what else can we say about them? The wear patterns and isotopic evidence on their teeth suggests they ate mostly like shrubs, fruits, occasionally small animals like lizards. But over their very long time on Earth, they actually evolved, and it looks like they gained the ability to chew and eat more difficult to digest grasses that maybe modern humans wouldn't be eating. And I guess it makes sense because they had a harder life than we do. Now, like chimps, AAs grew up very quickly. They had a very short juvenile period, which makes sense because they didn't live that long. They lived only about 40 years, so you wouldn't want to have too long of a juvenile period where they can't mate. Kind of the opposite of us modern humans, where we grow up very slowly now, sort of forever. Based on her skeletal development, we know that Lucy lived till full maturity, so we're talking about legitimate porn here, and she wasn't a juvenile, but that she died young, shortly after she achieved adulthood. And her skeleton shows plenty of evidence of degenerative disease, like in her spine, which suggests she lived a difficult life. Not surprising, she was swinging around in the trees. And in fact, it's been argued that that's actually how she died. She has multiple fractures that are consistent with a fall, supposedly. And these occurred at a perimortem time. Perimortem means right around the time of death. These are perimortem injuries. Now, how do people know these would be perimortem injuries? Basically, bone specialists look at injuries and they could see the extent to which they healed or did not heal. If those happened right around death, they were perimortem. That's probably then something that has to do with the person's death. But this is a bit controversial. None of this is totally sealed yet. How do we know so much about Lucy? Well, that's because they found actually 40% of her skeleton approximately, which is great. In this time, there's hominin species where they only have a couple of bones. So 40% is quite a lot. And they were able to study those bones. And in fact, it was such a sensation because this was all so new. In fact, her species wasn't even named, the AA species, till 4 years after she was discovered. That was in 1978. So this caused quite a sensation. Now, I'm not aware of any bones from the AA species that are in the context of like any kind of habitation or, some area of really occupation. But they have found worked bone, worked stone in East Africa at that time. And I believe then her species, the AA species, would be the only candidates to have made that. Their range, by the way, was Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, so East Africa we're talking about. That's where the A's lived. Lucy's discovery almost 50 years ago in 1974 was made by Donald Johanson, a paleoanthropologist who is alive and well today at 80 years old and based out of Arizona State University. Now, one morning, he and his student, a graduate student by the name of Tom Gray, were out doing a survey of their research area, and they just decided by chance to go back a different way. And they spotted the bones, and the rest is history. Johansson's work was under the auspices of the International Afar Research Expedition, of which Mary Leakey, another paleoanthropologist, was also a part. Now, you may have heard of her. She was very famous and discovered one of the most famous sites from this time period called Olduvai Gorge in nearby Tanzania. They were all part of the same sort of research group. Now, at the time, Lucy was one of the most complete, as I mentioned, skeletons ever found of a hominin. So she was overnight an international archaeology porn star. It's important to remember that many of these early species survive just, as I said, in a few bones or bone fragments. So there's often vigorous debate about whether they really are unique species, how they relate to each other in an evolutionary sense, etc. Now, how did she get the name Lucy? Well, apparently during the excavation process that summer, they were just playing a song on the radio or a tape, which was by the Beatles, called Lucy with Diamonds in the Sky.
Lucy in the sky with diamonds.
So they called the remains Lucy, and the name just stuck. Nowadays, by the way, naming human remains is kind of a no-no, but this was almost 50 years ago, so fine. Now, the Ethiopians call her Dinkanesh, which means something like "you are marvelous," and so that's how they refer to her. Today, you can see Lucy, as I did, in the National Museum in Ethiopia in Addis Ababa. The display is clear enough, but the exhibit, and in fact the whole museum, is a bit shabby. Multimedia and interactive displays are non-existent, and really the whole place could just use a fresh coat of paint. However, this is really not uncommon in a lot of developing and underdeveloped countries where they really have more pressing humanitarian needs than just sort of financing museums. So you can see a lot of old school museums of this type in places like Indonesia, Rwanda, Laos, other places that I've been. However, I was just a bit surprised because Lucy is so famous. I figured some NGO or foundation would step in to help, but alas, no. It's kind of sad because Ethiopia, as I've mentioned in the other segment, is such a proud country with a long history and fascinating culture that, what better way to instill pride among the people and get them jazzed up about their country than to showcase its history as really the cradle of human existence, the cradle of human life. But realistically, as I said, there are too many pressing problems in modern times. War, they had a war from 20 to 2022, basic subsistence and basic infrastructure development. So the museum will just need to wait. But you do also see this in some other countries that do have more resources and really should be putting more into their museums. Now, this all raises the issue of the treatment of human remains, because, of course, I'm considering Lucy alongside, other objects in the series like the Antikythera mechanism. But the fact of the matter is Lucy was a person, maybe not a Homo sapien, but a living, breathing person. And the way we deal with human remains now has evolved, and it's quite different, and the language is different. So, as I mentioned, for example, before, on an archaeological site, we do not give the remains pet names. We can take pictures but not post them all up on social media. And you may notice some changes in museums near you. Many museums will have a warning before people see human remains because that's not something everyone's comfortable with. They are dead people. And how has the language evolved? You'll often hear human remains instead of skeletons. You'll often now see mummified human remains instead of mummies. You'll hear enslaved people instead of slaves. And this is all to remind us that they were human beings with agency, with feelings, with emotions and stories just like ourselves, even if they lived a really long time ago. Now, personally, I'm really not a big fan of euphemisms and whitewashing, but I really do think this is a good thing. It reminds us that in studying ancient humans, we're looking into people's lives and humanizing them from a very long time ago. And, it may remind us that today there are people who are very far away from us, who we don't understand, people not so far away from us who we really don't like. And what we tend to do in those situations is dehumanize the people. And if we can humanize a gal who lived 3.18 million years ago, we can probably understand someone alive today. So that's my little pitch for what I think one of the main, contributions of archaeology is in today's world. Likewise, the enslaved people, for example, who worked all over the world for most of human history, they were not the nameless, faceless slaves that their owners thought them to be. They were enslaved people with feelings, emotions, and their own personal histories. So what does this all mean for archaeology? Well, it's complicated. 1990 was a big watershed year in the United States because of the passage of something called NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, which gave Native American tribes a lot more say and agency in what happens to the remains that are found. So definitely score one for minority rights and humanity, but there are legitimate concerns about what this means for science. And likewise, you see a lot of things in the international realm as well, in Australia and elsewhere, and internationally, with the rights. There was in 2007, the UN passed the Rights of Indigenous People, which part of it has to do with remains and cultural artifacts. But anyway, this also has led, as I've alluded to big changes on archaeological sites. There's special protocols and ways of handling human remains now that are, justified, but definitely add cost and complexity to a discipline that's quite strapped for cash already. Anyway, we're still figuring all this out, and the compromises are messy. How old does someone have to be? How old do human remains have to be before, we're comfortable with putting them in a glass case? They sort of they're losing their humanity. There's no really good answers. When does grandma just become human remains that you can display? But with that being said, I don't think there's much controversy around Lucy at almost 3.2 million years old and having been displayed for a long time already. She's going to remain where she is. And I would encourage you to go see her and to remember her humanity, that she was a person with feelings, because the exhibition that you're going to see doesn't do that part much justice. But go with an open mind. Also, while Lucy is definitely deserving of her international archaeology porn star status, and I definitely encourage you to pay her a visit, the exhibit is also symptomatic of a larger problem you unfortunately find in a lot of African countries, which is if you go into their museums, these are museums that were generally started by either colonial powers, or in Ethiopia's case, because it actually was never colonized, still under the tutelage of Europeans. And what you'll find in a lot of these museums is a lot of Palaeolithic stuff, a lot of ethnographic stuff, and a lot of sort of ecological, environmental stuff. And basically the implication of that is all this important stuff that happened in Africa is really long time ago. We sort of study these tribal people kind of the way we would study animals. And, nothing important happened there in the last 1,000 years, nothing worth learning. And that is kind of a problem. And you see that in a lot of these, colonial era museums all over Africa. So I think there is more sensitivity being paid to that now. And hopefully some of these museums are beginning to get upgrades, which will include a fuller vision of the history and, peoples of these countries and the really cultural richness that they do contain within them. Again, with this particular museum, the National Museum of Ethiopia, what I'm assuming, I don't know this for sure, so someone fact check me. I'm assuming this museum was founded under foreign tutelage. Addis Ababa was chock full, or still is chock full of an international community. There's a lot of international organizations there, like the African Union headquarters. And this particular museum being founded in the 1970s, that might have been under the Derg regime, the communist regime, which, was very heavily influenced and supported by the Soviet Union. So perhaps this is, sort of the product of Soviet workmanship, and that would make sense because of the very brutalist kind of architecture of the facility itself. And because that was sort of the bad old days of museum world, obviously this museum, even if when it was better funded and in better shape, wouldn't have done justice to the richness of the history and diversity of this wonderful and incredible country. All I really remember, other than the Lucy exhibit, was some stuff from the imperial family. Now, I was there about 10 years ago, so maybe the museum has seen an update, which would be great. And hopefully by the time you get there, it will be updated and shiny and new and have a more fuller collection that showcases the whole country, because Ethiopia is one you will want to visit. So that's another episode of Archaeology Porn. And, I bet little did this 3.2 million year old, 3'7" tall hot mama know that one day she would be an international archaeology porn star. And quite frankly, that is not something you see every day, even in the world of the internet, where you can find pretty much anything you want. All right, so for this week's episode, we are going to the Horn of Africa, to an amazing country, very little traveled, called Ethiopia. Now, honestly, Ethiopia is so rich culturally, historically, environmentally, that it was really difficult to narrow down the site to review. So what I did was I excluded sites that were purely of ecological or environmental interest. I excluded sites that may be very old but are active sites of worship and activity, like the amazing rock churches of Lalibela. And then there were sites that are archaeological in nature but are very freestanding and, easily visitable and in a great state of preservation, like the castles of Gondar. So this really narrowed down the list, and I wound up focusing on the Stele of Axum. Now, what are the Stele of Axum? First of all, stele is a plural word of stele, Stele, and I'll explain that later. Now, first, let's zoom out for the context. Now, Ethiopia is one of very few countries in the world, Thailand is another one that comes to mind, that's really never been colonized. Now, Ethiopia was taken over by fascist Italy for just about 5 years in 1936. And the Italians were forced to withdraw after their humiliating defeat in World War II. But with such a short period of occupation, they didn't leave much of their imprint on Ethiopia. About the only thing you can see Italian in Ethiopia is the people do like their spaghetti with tomato sauce, which they, by the way, eat on top of injera bread. So it's like a carb bomb, and they eat everything with injera bread. And other than that, you see a few modifications to the royal palace in Addis Ababa. But other than that, you don't really see Italy in Ethiopia. Anyway, for that reason, it's a totally unique culture. But much of the history of this culture is shrouded in mysteries and legends and myths. So the last ruling dynasty of Ethiopia, which was overthrown in 1974, that was the Emperor Haile Selassie, he was overthrown by a communist movement called the Derg, which was, initiated a terrible and tragic period in Ethiopian history. Well, that dynasty traced its origins all the way back to King David and Queen Sheba. And then that actually became somewhat popularized because of the Rastafarian movement, but that's a whole other story. But in any event, the point is this has a long history, but it's not really clear what is true and to what extent if we're talking about biblical stories. Anyway, since we're talking about the Queen of Sheba and King David of Israel, the population in Ethiopia used to be Jewish a long time ago. But after the Jews got expelled from Israel by the Romans, and that was in ancient times some 2,000 years ago, the Jewish population of Ethiopia became separated from the rest of the Jews in the world. So it developed quite differently, and it looks very different. And that population existed until the 70s. They're called falashas, Ethiopian Jews. And they basically all escaped the carnage that was going on at that time under the communist regimes, and they wound up in Israel, which is why you see a lot of Jews of African descent in Israel. So the falashas, the Ethiopian Jews, even though there are not many of them left in Ethiopia, given their very unique history, their descent from King David, they're a proud bunch. And one of the things they have to be proud of is that they are supposedly guardians in their country of the Ark of the Covenant. So that's the thing from Indiana Jones that melted people's faces off. The Ark of the Covenant is supposedly located in a church in Axum. Nobody's allowed in to see it, and there's a guardian, and he's not allowed out ever.
I've got to get out of here. I've got to get out of here. Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Stewardess, please let me handle this.
I've got to get out.
Calm down. Now get back to your seat. I'll take care of this. Calm down. Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Well, then after that, in the 4th century, which is a period we will be discussing now, the ruling dynasty of Ethiopia converted to Christianity, and hence most of the country became Christian. But with the spread of Islam and the Islamic invasions in North Africa, once again, Ethiopia was cut off, this time from the Christian world. And it developed very, very differently. Prior to that invasion, believe it or not, Egypt had been the most populous Christian country in the world. Now it's a very populous Muslim country. So things were very, very different back then. But anyway, Ethiopian Christianity developed, flourished, became a thing unto itself. It's the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. But the happy news is they actually maintained very good relations with their Muslim neighbors, because actually it was the Ethiopians who sheltered the Prophet Muhammad when he was evicted from Mecca. And you can still see where he was, and you can still see the supposed graves of his family members. So for that reason, it was a very, very peaceful place to be. So this is where we find ourselves. In the 4th century AD, King Ezana, and he's important for this segment, converted to Christianity. At the time, his country was predominant in the region. His dynasty was founded, the Aksumite dynasty, in 150 BC, and it rose in wealth and power due to its trade contacts with the Greco-Roman world, with Africa, and Arabia. So it was really a hub for trade. And that's also how it enters the written history. In the 1st century, Pliny the Elder, a Roman philosopher and historian, does mention Axum. In fact, at this time, Greek was widely spoken in Axum, and it was believed there were large Greek communities living there. So everything was hunky-dory until 960 AD, when Judith, a Jewish warrior queen, ransacked the place. And how cool is that? A warrior queen? Take that, Xena, warrior princess. Anyway, so Axum was on the rise and near its peak when King Ezana converted to Christianity. However, if you're going to change something as important to people as their religion, you've got to do it carefully. So one of the strategies that's happened in many different contexts as, ruling dynasties and governments changed their religion is they incorporated elements from what was there already, to try to rock the boat as little as possible and let the people keep some of their traditions. However, they put a twist on it. So suddenly, for example, this sacred druidic grove becomes a place that Jesus visited, and that's why it's so special. Or the day for the Roman sun god suddenly becomes Christmas, the birthday of the baby Jesus. So that's exactly what happened with our stele, or remember, that's the plural of form of stele. That's what happened. It was an older tradition that was incorporated into the new Christian practices of the dynasty. Now, what were these stelae used for? They were basically used to commemorate the dead. Most of the big ones, anyway, seem to have tombs and burials underneath them or nearby. So that was the point. They were funerary. And why are they called stele, a stele, you ask, and not like an obelisk? Well, it has to do with the top. An obelisks have that pyramidal shape. These stelae are kind of rounded at the top. So that's why they're not obelisks. So there are two kinds of stelae in Axum. The most famous ones, of course, are the ginormous ones. And these range from about 15 meters or 50 feet in height to 33 meters or about 108 feet in height. So they're pretty tall. Now, they're elaborately carved, resembling like a multi-story building with a door at the base. And there's a lot of interpretations behind this, but the thought is that maybe they gave the king access, all the way because they're so tall to heaven. That's what it's supposed to represent. And of course, the really big ones are for the kings. Where they found the architectural inspiration for these stela is unknown, but there is some suggestion that they do resemble some ancient and poorly documented and understood towers in what is today southwestern Saudi Arabia. Now, that's not at all far-fetched, considering at the time, Axum was a great empire that stretched into present-day Yemen and even Oman. So that's an area that definitely would have been known to them. So it is possible. Now, unfortunately, most of them toppled. There's only two that are currently freestanding. Some toppled even since the 1906 excavation. Some, it's thought, toppled in the 18th or 19th century. And one, in fact, the Great Stele, the one that's like 100 whatever feet tall, that probably toppled as it was being erected or not long after. Now, the big guy is unique because it's elaborately carved on all four sides, whereas the others, big ones, are blank on the back. And it did collapse, and in its fall, it crushed a megalithic tomb called today Nefas Mocha. In fact, there are tombs all around the stela, but these actually were long ago looted, so there wasn't much found in them. And those looters were really, really tenacious. So they dug a lot of holes, and it's believed that actually destabilized the stela, which is why some of them fell. And also the sandy soil in the area didn't really help. But nearby the stela, among the stela field, you can find a whole bunch of tombs. The tomb of the false door, the tomb of bricks, the mausoleum, and there's still certainly others buried underground. The Great Stele is supposedly dedicated to King Ramhai, but I couldn't find much information about him, and I'm not really sure how airtight that is, because remember, most of Ethiopian history is shrouded in mysteries, and it's kind of mixed up. So, for example, all over the country, you'll find various monuments and places that supposedly belong to Queen Sheba. Like in Axum, there's a palace that supposedly belonged to her. But this was dated much, much later than she would have been alive. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of myths you'll hear if you visit these places. Now, as I mentioned, there's only two of the big stela that are freestanding. One of those is known as the Roman stele, and that's had a pretty interesting life. So let's start there. You see, fascist Italy stole that one in 1937 after it occupied the country. But as we know, that didn't last too long. And after Italy's defeat in World War II, it promised in a treaty to give the stele back. That was in 1947. But just to turn the knife, what Italy did with the stele when they did take it was they erected it right in front of the Ministry of African Colonies in Rome. So the irony of that, they stole something from the African colonies and they put it up in Rome. Anyway, it stayed there until 2005. So the Italians really dragged their feet on this one. To be fair, it was logistically very complicated and expensive. But there was even some talk that they tried to weasel their way out of it, and this is how. That Ministry of Colonies is very short-lived. That later became the UNFAO, the the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. So there was some talk like, well, heritage is global for all of humanity. And we put this thing in front of what's now a global organization. So maybe it should just stay there and represent all of humanity. Well, as you can imagine, that one did not fly too well with Ethiopia and some others. Already broken in 5 pieces when the Italians first took it. When they took it down in Rome, they were able to break it into 3 pieces along some of the original cracks, and they flew it in, I believe, 3 separate cargo planes, 3 flights to Ethiopia over the year 2005. And they would have to do this because this thing weighed a ton at 170 tons, as it was all originally one slab of granite. And supposedly it was the most heavy parcel ever delivered. Now, it was re-erected in Axum in 2008 after a lot of painstaking work to keep it stable. So they, I believe, put some concrete under it so it wouldn't fall again. So this was a big win for repatriation, a topic we've talked a little bit about. And repatriation is a more complex topic than is sometimes portrayed in the media. But one good thing is that the attitudes towards it have progressed a lot in recent years. So when, it was first agreed to be returned to Ethiopia, that was just kind of because winner takes all. Winners get the spoils. It wasn't because of some recognition that, countries should return the stuff they've looted. It was basically Italy lost, we want our stuff back. However, by the 2000s, again, that was not going to fly. And it was recognized that this was a pretty clear-cut case for repatriation. It was stolen without any kind of justification after only 5 years in the country. Or actually, no, it was stolen when Italy, the year after they arrived, after they took over. So there was really very little justification to keep this thing, and it was a very, very obvious case for repatriation. Another noteworthy one is King Ezana's stele. He was the one who converted to Christianity, and his stele is definitely attributable. What makes it so unique is that's one that actually never fell. So of the big ones, there's only 2 standing, but one of them is the Roman one, which was actually broken when the Italians took it. So the King Ezana's is the only one that's been standing the whole time, which is quite an accomplishment for something that's more than 1,500 years old and something like 68 feet high. So that is really the real deal. However, in 2008, when the Roman stele was erected, they did take some works to stabilize King Ezana's stele because it was leaning somewhat precipitously. Otherwise, there are 3 or 4 other monumental stela ranging in height from approximately 6 to 18 meters, that would be 18 to 80 feet, but these have all since toppled. These big guys in the main stela field, because there are 2 other areas around Axum with stela, well, they must have been an awe-inspiring sight in their day. They were erected sort of in a hill overlooking the city, so everyone could look up and see the kings looking over them or watching out for them. Now, the effect is a little bit lost today because the modern city has changed, but it must have been pretty awe-inspiring at the time. Amazingly, these giant stela were all carved from single pieces of granite and brought from a place called Gobo-Dura Hill, which is actually 4 kilometers away. So that's a lot of stone to move. Now, they know it was from that spot because they've actually found the signs of quarrying. So you could think of that as like the birthplace of the stela. Just like if you go to Easter Island, Rapa Nui, you could see the birthplace of the Moai. But anyway, that's for another episode, which, well, I will do at a later time. So how did they move all these stones? How did they do it? Nobody really knows. Probably a lot of the same techniques, similar techniques that were used to move, for example, the stones of Stonehenge or the stones of the pyramid. Maybe something more sophisticated, because remember, this is a lot later than those. Stonehenge was like 3,000 years BC, and the pyramids even, older, some of them. So maybe there was some greater technology involved. So there's some ideas, but to my knowledge, no one has done any experimental archaeology on that the way they have done with the pyramids, with the Easter Island Moai, etc. And that brings me to another point, which is there's still so much we don't know about this site. Part of the reason was because it was altered and maintained over the years, but without records really being kept. It was looted, as I mentioned, a lot, and it was left to decay. So it's quite, heavily altered over the years. Now, there have been a bunch of excavations there, which I will go into, but these are quite limited in scope or really old. So it was before, the most modern and scientific methods were available. As far as I can tell, the first serious archaeological work done on site was done in 1906 by a German team led by a guy called Littmann. Now, they published their work in 1913, and this is where, the high-quality drawings that I've been showing you, this is where they were produced. And this was the first team to systematically map the site. Now, they gave the different stela numbers, and that brings me to the next point, which there are actually hundreds of stela, hundreds, but they're just not all the monumental ones I've been talking about, of which there are 6 or 7. At the main stela field that we've been talking about, there's a total of 120 of them. Then at a site west known as DIT Stela field, remember that's our Jewish warrior queen. There are literally hundreds of the smaller stela. And then there's yet another site southeast of this area, which there's a handful of them. So there's quite a lot of stela all around the city of Axum. However, most of these are pretty much unadorned. A lot of them are buried or fallen over. So not much is really known about them. All we can safely say is they probably weren't great and powerful kings and rulers like the giant ones would have been for. Anyway, the French had their turn in 1954 to 1957 with their excavations. But as far as I could tell, there were no big aha moments that arose out of that dig.
I'm having an aha moment with Steve.
The Brits, led by Neville Chittick, had their excavation from 1972 to 1974. And it was at that time that a lot of those tombs were excavated. And then much later, another British team led by a guy named David Phillipson, that was from 1993 to 1997. They had some excavations. I didn't find too many takeaways. I think one of them was by the car park, but the main one that I read about was at the site where the Roman stela had been. And this sort of mapped the topography at the time the stela was erected. And that work was taken over by an Ethiopian team led by a guy called Bayen. Then there was a joint French-Ethiopian excavation in 1999. This was again in that same area around the base of where the Roman stela was. And through this, they determined sort of how the bases for the stela were established, with several layers of nesting stones and like a mortar-like substance. So, it was pretty hard to keep these things upright. And as we know, it wasn't so successful. Finally, in the 2000s, there was some limited geophysical surveys, which did show anomalies under the ground, which may very well be tombs that are still under there. So that all sounds like a lot of research, but as mentioned, a lot of it was quite limited. Some of it was done a long time ago without modern methods. And as far as I can tell, there really hasn't been an effort incorporating the latest techniques and a lot of science that can tell us, a lot that we don't already know. Now, as for the visit, it's interesting. There's a museum on site, but there's not a whole lot of information. You will need a guide. I can't remember. A guide might even be compulsory, but there's no point in going without one. That's the point. And when you're on your tour listening, you do have to have your bullshit meter turned up, because remember, a lot of what you'll hear in Ethiopia is, myths, and it's hard to sometimes parse that with what's known definitively. Now, that small museum adjacent to the site is actually interesting with a good collection. They have a bunch of these ancient stone tablets written in a variety of ancient languages, old coins, drinking vessels, and a 700-year-old Bible. Now, you actually see quite a few of those in the ancient churches of this northern Ethiopian region because it's quite dry, and the Bible seemed to survive well in that climate. But man, you got to go get that shit laminated.
Are a few basic things to understand just how a laminator works.
Now, this northern region is called Tigray, and it's chock full of amazing sites. My favorite were the rock churches of Gibraltar, where priests would live a semi-hermetic existence. Now, it was a pretty treacherous climb up there, but you're well rewarded for the experience and the views. And if you're lucky, you'll meet a very nice hermit priest. But seriously, it was hairy getting up there. There were times where we had to take off our shoes because we couldn't grip the sheer rock. However, if Tigray rings a bell, it's probably for all the wrong reasons. There was just a ruinous war fought there from 2020 to 2022 because there was a rebel group in Tigray that really felt that they get the shaft from the central government and they're not treated well. You see, Ethiopia is a mosaic of different ethnicities, groups, tribes, and so stability is never really a sure thing. But they were able to make peace. It just was after tens or even hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of refugees. So even though this ended, 2 years ago or so, I'm not really sure what the visit there now is like. And that's the thing about Ethiopia. It has an incredibly rich history and culture, but more recently it's known for war, famine, and its maniacally violent communist regime in the 1970s and 80s, like I said, known for all the wrong reasons. But as you travel around the country, you'll find the people to be hospitable and proud, and honestly, the food is great. It's the closest comparison I could make is Indian food, but it is really quite different and very special and very unique, just like the whole country. However, it's not easy to get there and to get around. The infrastructure's poor, so you'll need to hire a driver and a guide, and that isn't cheap. But just like those rock churches of Gibraltar, you will be richly rewarded for your trouble. So there you have it, the Stele of Axum. A really, really cool site, a good example of repatriation in this very unique and mysterious country. I definitely recommend a visit. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.